Thank you for coming. Today I want to briefly explain why the European Union, particularly for the UK, has become a force for, I believe, social injustice, and why leaving provides a vital opportunity for us to be able to develop policies that will protect the people who often find themselves at the sharp end of global economic forces and technological change. My plea to better-off Britons who have done well in recent years is to consider their vote in the referendum to vote for a better deal for people who haven't enjoyed the same benefits as maybe they have. Because the EU, despite its grand early intentions, has become, I believe, a friend of the haves rather than a friend of the have-nots. Take the euro, for example. It has greatly favoured already wealthy Germany and its export industries at the expense of southern Europe. The euro has meant serious unemployment for millions of young Greeks, Portuguese, Spaniards and Italians, and has produced political extremism across the continent. The EU is also working well for big banks. The bailouts being financed by extreme levels of austerity in countries like Greece have largely benefited financial institutions that lent irresponsibly before the crash and caused it. The EU is also working for big corporates that benefit from mass immigration, businesses that have underinvested for decades in the productivity and training of their own local workforces and have no reason, as I see it, to mend their ways so long as cheap labour can be imported from abroad. But if the EU is working for Germany, for banks, for big corporates and for the public affairs companies with large lobbying operations in Brussels, the EU isn't working for over-regulated small business and, more importantly, in fact, lower paid and lower skilled Britons. They now have to compete with millions of people from abroad for jobs and a wage rise. The government's own Migration Advisory Committee reported that for every 100 migrants employed here, 23 UK-born workers would have been displaced. The construction of the Olympic Park was a powerful illustration of the way in which those who had come in, those migrants, undercut UK workers through their willingness to endure family-friendly living conditions. Visiting job centres as I did, Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, in East London, which is where my constituency is at the time, I met both skilled and unskilled workers who struggled to get work on that site. When I asked why, they said that people from Eastern Europe, often living in bedsits in various parts of East London, without UK housing and family costs that they did, hugely underbid them for their work. Since then, those stories have been borne out by the facts. Despite all the statements about the Olympic Park helping British workers, we now know that some half of all the jobs on the site went to foreign nationals. Given this evidence, I find the Labour Party's current position somewhat ironic. As Frank Field has pointed out, in saying that they are now in favour of staying in the EU, they are acting against the interest, I believe, of the communities they purport actually to serve. Even Stuart Rose of the Stronger In campaign has admitted that immigration cuts the pay of the poor in a rare moment of candour, maybe one of the reasons why we no longer see him on the television or the radio, and acknowledged that wages will go up for many Britons if immigration is restricted. The downward pressure on wages is a trend and will only get worse if we continue to have absolutely open borders with the EU, and I believe would get much worse if we ended up in a recession. A Bank of England study in December 2015 concluded, and I want to quote this because this is rather important, the biggest effect is that the semi-unskilled service sector, where a 10 percentage point rise in the proportion of immigrants is associated with a 2% reduction in pay. This significantly affects British workers, especially those on low wages. We know that EU migration has increased by 50% since 2010, and that's on the official figures. We may know more later. If the number of EU job seekers entering the UK over the next decade remains at current levels, some 690,000 people, and I repeat that figure, some 690,000 people will have been added to the UK population as a direct result. With 5 more countries due to join, the number looks conservative. This would be the equivalent of a city the size of Glasgow in the UK. And another big negative economic effect of the level of immigration is that British people have never voted for and do not want is on house prices. Young people are the biggest losers from this. they are being forced to pay an ever larger share of their incomes on accommodation and suffering longer commutes and often have to move far away from their families. The fact is that we need to build around 240 houses every day for the next 20 years just to be able to cope with the increased demand from future migration. Of course, there are a number of issues in the difficulty to get housing in the UK, but the impact of uncontrolled immigration makes it a major factor in the demand for housing, one that simply cannot be denied or ignored. And official data shows that over the last 15 years, over two-thirds, some 66%, of the additional households created in the UK were headed by a person born abroad. The struggle to get on the housing ladder is one that affects families up and down the UK. Such is the pressure that the average age for a first-time buyer is now 31. And everyone should have the opportunity, I believe, and always have done, to own their own home. But as the EU continues to expand to other countries such as Macedonia, Albania and Turkey, the population pressures of remaining in the EU, if someone votes to remain in the EU, can only make that prospect less likely. And as the government's own recent figures show, to cope with the kind of pressure that immigration is placing on the schools system, the taxpayer is having to find extra school places, equivalent to building 27 new average-sized secondary schools or 100 new primary schools. So my Vote Leave and Conservative colleague Priti Patel was correct when she highlighted recently the fact that, as always, when public services are under pressure, those without the resources to afford the alternatives are most vulnerable and the most affected. In short, getting a place in your local school gets more and more difficult. And the heavy burden of EU regulation is particularly hard on the smaller businesses that all evidence shows are the best route back to the workforce for those who are unemployed. Even though the vast majority of these businesses never trade with the EU, they are subject to EU red tape at the cost of tens of billions of pounds. And those regulations don't just mean lower profits for small entrepreneurs. They also mean fewer new businesses starting up and fewer jobs created. And then there are the higher grocery prices that the EU's common agricultural policy has produced. The Independent House of Commons Library has concluded that EU membership actually increases the cost of living. And they stated that the EU's common agricultural policy, and I quote, artificially inflates food prices, and that, quote, consumer prices across a range of other goods imported from outside the EU are raised as a result of the common external tariff and trade imposed by the EU. These tariff barriers have an effect, and these include footwear, a 17% tariff, bicycles, a 15% tariff, and a range of clothing, a 12% tariff. This may not sound like a lot for some of the better off British families, but for many, it might actually be the difference between paying the rent or not being able to pay the rent. And this takes me back to my central point. What I think are the best compassionate instincts of the British people. When you vote on the 23rd of June, even if you believe what you are now being told by those who want you to vote to remain in the European Union, that you may on balance have done okay from the European Union. I want you to think about the people who haven't. And just as importantly, think about the economic changes that are coming down the tracks very fast. And ask yourself very seriously whether a Britain in charge of all policy levers would be better equipped to cope with those changes than a Britain that is part of what all evidence suggests is the dysfunctional, declining, high unemployment European Union. Because this EU vote is happening at a time of enormous global upheaval. We are at the point in the development of the world economy where, if we are not careful, we're going to see a huge rise and even an explosion in the have-nots. We're going to see increasing divides between people who have a home of their own and those who, to coin a phrase used rather recently, are at the back of the queue. A lengthening queue to boot. To even get onto the housing ladder, people who have jobs that are threatened by automation and people who live in the shadow of the impact of technological innovation, people who benefit from the immigration of cheap nannies and baristas and labourers, and people who can't find work because of uncontrolled immigration. There is a balance here that needs to be reset. And I've always wanted them to be able to own their own home, but that gets more difficult, particularly, as I said, for young people through our inability to control the scale of migration. We are entering a long period of much slower growth than we have perhaps been used to. We're entering a period when white-collar jobs are going to be replaced, possibly by technology on the same scale that innovation has already placed many more manual, industrial, and other blue-collar jobs. And in the coming decades, the populations of China and India and other developing countries will increasingly be educated and will compete more directly with us. In this world, we need to be nimble, and we need to do everything we can to ensure that those likely to be most affected by these changes are ideally equipped to meet them, or, if necessary, are cushioned from those worst effects. Being fast on our feet and nimble as a nation-state is the route to that. And Britain avoiding the high unemployment and savage austerity that many European nations suffered because we wisely ignored the advice of many groups, particularly the CBI, and retained sterling. The principle is that it is better to be in control of our own destiny. That is the lesson we learn. Better to be in control of our own destiny. Should apply to all areas of national life, particularly starting with our borders. It should cover the design of agricultural and environmental policies and the implication of those policies for grocery and energy bills, to the design of trade agreements, to fishery policies, another regressive EU policy that has devastated some of our coastal communities, and of course to budget and tax policy. If we want to cut VAT on fuel to help families afford to heat their homes, we should be free to do so. We should be able to choose how to spend the £350 million that we currently send to Brussels every single week. It would be, in a normal world, a strange choice to make for a British government that, whilst bearing down on welfare spending and other budgets since the election, we continue to send to this wealthy EU hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money. This is money that could help fund a whole variety of areas, particularly the NHS, and it could find extra training for infrastructure to help every Briton thrive in the economic age and to meet those challenges. The EU is fast sliding to economic irrelevance. Just look at how it's losing its share of world trade at twice the rate of the United States. And there are many reasons for this. But one key reason is that its institutions have become irredeemably unwieldy. EU leaders and the Brussels army of bureaucrats can't agree on how to fix the euro. They can't agree on what to do about refugees. They cannot agree on what kind of transatlantic trade partnership they actually want with the USA. Such a mess that it is very unlikely that it will ever happen. And they cannot agree on the kind of steel and industrial policies that will ensure Europe doesn't even lose more of its manufacturing base. No. The EU can only move as quickly as its slowest member. And that means that it can only move very slowly indeed on all these matters. And in today's global economy, it's not speed that kills, but indecision. The EU leaders and ministers spend so much time in Brussels not agreeing decisions that they aren't focused on the challenges that exist back in their home nations. And that is, I think, the key point. No matter what those who want to remain say about the EU as a marketplace, the reality is that it is first and foremost a political project, the aim of which is the creation of an overarching federal power above the nation states. It is the reason why economic common sense cannot prevail and why many Greeks are now living in third world conditions. Italian banks are becoming insolvent and terrible levels of youth unemployment have become, for the EU, a terrible price worth paying. Yet outside of the EU, an independent Britain can design migration, agriculture, environmental, budgetary and trade policies, and the rest of Europe seems sadly incapable of agreeing on any of these. I hope I persuaded you that leaving the EU is in the clear interests of social justice within Britain. But let me end by saying, I also think it could advance social justice across the whole of the continent. A vote to leave by the British people might be the shock to the EU system that is so desperately needed. Perhaps I'm being a touch unrealistic. The EU does not have a great track record of changing course after member states have voted against EU projects in referenda. But Brexit, coming after the Greek crisis, after so much impossibly high youth unemployment, after the election of so many extreme parties, should be the moment when Brussels finally decides to give member states more freedom to design economic, social and migration policies, those that reflect the democratic will and particular needs of each individual state. Given we are so uninfluential inside the EU, our maximum moment of influence, ironically, might be at leaving it. Confronting the rest of the EU with the need and opportunity to radically change its structure is the most socially just and, indeed, European service that Britain can provide to our neighbours across the Channel. Surely, like me, you believe that the United Kingdom can do better. We deserve to do better. Why should we set such a low vision about our future by tying it to this failing project and all that is coming down the tracks to diminish us? Inside the EU, our politicians can only talk of what we would like to do to change things, knowing that they will achieve very little, if any, of that. Outside the EU, we can change our destiny and dare to believe in the greatness of our citizens. Let me just repeat that. Outside of the EU, we can dare to change our destiny. That is the purpose of a vote to leave. Britain deserves better than all of this, which is why on the 23rd of June, we should take back control and vote for our own British Independence Day. Thank you very much.